going to begin by reading out of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We'll begin here in the 7th verse. The Apostle Paul is writing to the Thessalonica church. And let me just set the tone a little bit here. Jesus is risen from the dead. It's been multiple decades since he has gone into heaven. The church has spread and is continuing to spread across the Gentile world up into Asia Minor. And the Apostle Paul is writing to one of the churches that has been born as a result of the gospel. And so this is the second letter that he writes to them. And there was some sort of debate going on at that time as to why Christ hadn't returned. They still hadn't fully understood that there would be thousands of years and multiple generations that were yet to be born into the earth, as well as the events that would be leading up to the return of the Lord. And so Paul, as he writes this second letter to them, he goes right to the heart of the matter and begins to reveal to them the timing, what will precede the coming of the Lord, and the events that will be transpiring on the world at that time. So let's get into it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I'm going to begin reading with the 7th verse. Paul is speaking and he says this. He says, "For the mystery of iniquity does already work, or is already at work. Only he who now lets," and that word letteth in the King James literally means holding down something, or to hold something down. And we're going to explore what he meant by the mystery of iniquity here. Now listen, for the mystery of iniquity does already work. Only he, and he's referencing the Holy Spirit here, he who holds down iniquity, in other words, it could be read that way, will hold it down, or will let, he says, until he is taken out of the way. All right, let's get into our study today. Again, like I said, where we pick up this verse, Paul is talking specifically about what he called the son of perdition, the man of sin, that lawless one. He's referencing who we call the antichrist, right? Now listen, in verse 4, he begins to reveal his character and his quality. And listen to what he says here in verse 3. He says, "Do not let any man deceive you by any means. For that day will not come except there comes a falling away first, and that man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition." Now listen to his personality traits. "Who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sits in the temple of God." Showing himself that he is God. Now he goes on to say, and this is something they talked about a lot, so he calls to mind, right? Verse 5, "Do you not remember, or remember ye not, that when I was with you, I told you about this. I told you about these things." Then he says, "And now you know what is holding back the return of the Lord." And the revelation of Christ in his time, but also the revelation of that wicked one in his time. He says something is holding it back. Something is holding the return of the Lord. That's what he's talking about here in chapter 2, verse 1. The subject is this: "I beseech you, brothers, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together unto him." So that's the subject. They're all wondering, when's he coming back, right? What's going to happen? But basically what he goes on to say here is what we just read, is that someone else has to come first. Someone has to come first. Now listen to what he says, because it's really interesting. In verse 7, he's revealing that it has in essence been unfolding, that is the mystery of iniquity, verse 7, since ancient times. Now let's take a look at what these words mean. In verse 7, he calls it the mystery of iniquity. Now the word mystery comes from the word mysterion. Mysterion. That is where we get our understanding of, and literally what he's talking about here, is it literally means secrets or silence. But it's not just holding a secret or silence. Mysterion literally means secrets and silence that are imposed upon individuals. Pay attention. Imposed upon individuals by initiation into occult ritual and occult practice and occult rites, ceremonies. It's extraordinary what he's saying here. He's saying that the emergence of the wicked one, the emergence of the antichrist, is directly tied to the occult. And he says that it is mysterion, that is, it is tied to secrets and rituals. It is tied to initiation into select groups. The occult elite is really what he's referring to. Listen, the mystery of iniquity. The word iniquity means, or comes from the Greek word anomia. It means to intentionally have contempt for restraint, to have contempt for divine structure or commandment. So now let's put this together, and we're headed somewhere, so hopefully you'll hang with us. Listen, he's talking about the return of the king. He then begins to tell them it can't happen. Something has to happen before he returns. What that's going to be, he says, is directly tied to ancient occult ritual. That they are working as a counterbalance against he, in verse 7, who is holding that back. He's basically saying that the Holy Spirit is holding that back. He's holding the revelation of the son of perdition back. But he reveals in verse 7 that these secret societies, these occult elite who have been initiated into ritual and ceremony and practice, has been something that has been actually playing itself out over thousands of years. That the struggle has been against that. The fight between the forces of light, the forces of darkness, right? So listen, he says the mysterion, literally in Greek it's mysterion anomia enherheo. That's literally how he was saying it. It's that understand, he says, this has been an unfolding since ancient times. It has been attempted, they are attempting to bring this about, that wicked one. And he says, but up to this point, the full expression of their contempt for divine framework, structure, law, the commandments of the Creator, the Father in heaven. Up until this point, they continue through the centuries, through their rituals, through their magic, through their rites, to attempt to bring about what he calls the lawless one, or the son of perdition. And he's telling the early church, understand this energy, energeo, it's already at work. In other words, the word energeo means to be active or in operation. It means to be powerful. And the word en, that if you look it up yourself, you'll see energeo. The word en literally means through yielded channels, instruments of the secret rites or the ancient occult. This is really incredible what he's saying. And he's literally saying that throughout the generations since the beginning of time, he's telling the early church, there have been individuals who have, and collective groups of occult elite who have availed themselves to become channels by which energy is flowing. And they have one specific goal in mind. They have one specific intent. And that is to create a climate where the forces of darkness push back the forces of light and allow the wicked one to be revealed, to be unveiled. He says it's already working. It's already in operation back then. Okay, so let's get into what we're going to talk about today. See, he goes on, basically what he's saying and what he's telling us is to fully understand, to fully grasp what we're talking about, we have to journey all the way to the beginning. With that in mind, turn over to Genesis chapter 10. And now we're going to get into the meat of what we're talking about here today. Remember what the context is. For those of you who watched our reel, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch it after this posting here if you so like. But we've called this message the Fortress of Anu, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But it's part one. Part two will be next week, Lord willing, if that's the direction we're going to continue to head. But the two are connected, and we'll get into that a little later. But remember, the context of what Paul is talking about here is the unveiling or the revelation in his time. He's basically telling them of the early church, there is coming a time in the far-flung future where there will be a specific time frame when he will emerge. His emergence is directly tied to the ancient and occult rituals that were revealed to men and women throughout the ages. They basically have become occult ritual societies and have worked with the forces of evil, continuously attempting to bring about the manifestation of their own Messiah, so to speak. Now listen, let's read Genesis chapter 10, if you're there, because we're going to look at someone the Bible identifies as Nimrod. His name means rebellion. And if you've been with us long enough, you know Isaiah 46, verse 9 and 10 speaks of a principle of biblical interpretation called God declaring the end of all things from the beginning. So with all that we've talked about in mind, this is where we are. We go back to the beginning to see if we can find any clues as to what we are experiencing now and what is just ahead in the months and just short years, I believe, just ahead of us. Now listen, let's read this. In Genesis chapter 10, verse 7, or actually verse 6. Let's start with verse 6. And the sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, notice the Bible now draws our attention to Cush, the firstborn, coming through the line of Ham. He then goes on to identify the sons of Cush. The sons of Cush are Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ra'amah, Sabteka. And listen to this, verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Now let's break this down. Nimrod, his name means rebellion. And something interesting is revealed here, because what we begin to see transpiring here is that Nimrod begins to hook himself up to information that appears to have completely altered who he was. We're going to get into that in a little deeper, but we know that something took place after the flood. After the flood, the Bible reveals here that an event took place where Noah creates a vineyard, harvests the grapes, he gets drunk, he goes into his tent, and he disrobes and then kind of like collapses. And then look what it says here in chapter 9, verse 22, so you know what I'm talking about. It says, and Ham, well, look at verse 20, chapter 9, verse 20. Noah began to be a husbandman. He plants a vineyard, verse 21. He drinks the wine. He gets drunk. He gets uncovered inside his tent. He's naked. And then verse 22, something happens with his son. It says, Ham, who is the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and went out and told his two brothers. Then it says that Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it upon their shoulders. They walked backwards and they covered the nakedness of their son. When Noah wakes up from his wine, he understood what his younger son had done to him. I'm not going to get into the gory details here, but you can do your own studies. He apparently did something that was perverse and of an unspeakable nature to his father. As a result of that, Noah awakens and realizes that something had been done to him. When we tie that to our understanding and subject of what we're talking about here, the Bible immediately takes us to the line of Ham and his sons. And then it launches, as we read here, with his eldest son, Cush. And then it goes through a series of the sons of Cush, and then Cush's final son was named Nimrod. So what we begin to understand first and foremost from this, if you think it through, so what the scriptures appears to be telling us is a family, Noah and his family, made their way over to the other side after this cataclysmic flood, which, by the way, many legends throughout the kingdoms of the world, if you will, the ancient kingdoms of the world, in their writings mention this cataclysmic flood. What the scripture is talking to us about then, if we think it through, is that this means that this family, Ham, Japheth, Shem, Noah, their wives, their mother, they were part of that other world. They were part of the world that had been destroyed. And so they were eyewitnesses to an extraordinary series of events that ultimately culminated with a judgment that cleansed the earth with water. But something happens here. Ham moves in a very satanic way, appears to violate his father in a way that Noah speaks about. He's done something. He knew what he did to him. He then immediately he curses Canaan, and basically the line of Cush becomes a satanic line. And what ends up happening out of this is that our attention is then turned in the genealogy to Cush and his sons. Now, I believe what is being revealed here is that in their discussions, because of what Nimrod goes on to do, which we'll look at here in a second, in their discussions, they must have had discussions that dealt with what happened before the flood. And we'll see this here in a second because of what Nimrod does. Now listen, it says that it implies that these pre-flood mysteries, these pre-flood events were revealed to this lineage. Remember what Paul talked about? He talked about the mystery of iniquity, these occult initiations, these ancient, what we call mythologies, folklore, the secret arts. All of that had an origin somewhere, sometime in the post-flood world. Well, as we go into studying the events around this, it appears that knowledge came through the line of Ham and Cush and ultimately culminated with Nimrod. Now listen, I'm going to read you something out of the book of Enoch. And I want you to understand first and foremost that what I'm going to read is not considered scripture in this sense that it's included in the 66 books of the Bible. However, if you go into the book of Jude and you read, Jude quotes from the book of Enoch. You read the writings of Paul, and I'll give you the scripture verses in a minute. He quotes from the book of Enoch. You read in the writings of the Apostle Peter, he references the book of Enoch. And so what we're looking at is not necessarily, I'm going to say, scripture per se, but they are extra biblical sources, if you will, that can lend some sort of understanding to us. But you take it with a grain of salt, so to speak. You do your own studies. But this is something that was very familiar. Now let me just read to you before I read what the book of Enoch says, because this is where we will get some information as to quite possibly what was being spoken about between Ham and Cush and his son Nimrod. Now listen, according to scholars, the origins of the book of Enoch were found during the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran. You can go do your own studies on that. But they found the fragments and great portions of the books of Enoch amongst those scrolls. There's a man by the name of Ephraim Isaac. He's the editor and the translator of the book of Enoch. And he writes this. He says that the book of Enoch, or First Enoch, is clearly a composite which represents numerous periods and writers, and that the dating of the various sections span from pre-Maccabean times as early as 200 BC. So the 2nd century before the calendar changed, so to speak, before the birth of Christ, 300 years before then. George W.E. Nicholsburg writes that First Enoch is a collection of Jewish apocalyptic traditions that date from at least the last 3 centuries before the Common Era. Now listen, there is little doubt that Enoch was influential in molding New Testament doctrines about the Messiah, the Son of Man, the Messianic kingdom, demonology, the resurrection, eschatology. The limits of the influence of Enoch are discussed at length, and you can look up this yourself, by R.H. Charles, Ephraim Isaac, and J.W. Nicholsburg in their respectives, their translations, and their commentaries. Now, with that in mind, I'm just doing due diligence here and letting you know as we head into these writings, because I believe this is the information that was accessed, or at least taught to Nimrod, because it produced within him a desire to do something. Now listen, the book of Enoch. Enoch, who was Enoch? He was the great grandfather of Noah, which would give us, and you can go read that in the genealogies in Genesis, which would give us an understanding as to how it is this information would come down through that family line by way of Ham and Cush and then ultimately Nimrod. So Enoch was the great grandfather of Noah. And his book was found in the caves of Qumran amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now listen, and again, I emphasize this is extra biblical source material. It's not scripture, but it is source material. It's almost like you can take it like someone commenting on history from the point of view of time that is now past, and a historian looking back. It seems to be something like that. Now listen, according to this, the translation that was given to us by R.H. Charles, who I already referenced, this is what he said he found amongst the scrolls. This is from 1 Enoch chapter 1. Now listen to what it says. It says, the words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and the righteous, who will be living in the day of the tribulation, when all the wicked and the godless are to be removed. He said, I, Enoch, a righteous man, had my eyes opened by God. I saw visions of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angels showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood and I saw. But what I see and what I write is not for this generation, but it is for a remote generation in the far future, which is yet to come. So that is how the book of Enoch begins, talking about a far-flung generation in the future, well ahead of his days. I believe that's our time. Now listen, he goes on to prophesy a whole bunch of things, and I'm just going to read this real quick. He says, concerning the elect, this is my prophecy concerning them, or my parable. Listen to what's revealed here. The Holy Great One will come forth from his dwelling. The eternal God will tread upon the earth on Mount Sinai, and he shall appear from his camp. He shall appear in strength of his might from the heaven of heavens, and all shall be smitten with fear. Listen, he now begins to identify what is called the watchers. And all the watchers shall quake, and fear and trembling shall seize them unto the ends of the earth. And the high mountains shall be shaken, and the hills shall be made low. They shall melt like wax before the flame, and the earth shall be totally rent asunder. He's like accelerated. He begins here, if you're following me, by revealing that God is indeed, the Creator is going to come in the future from his writing. This is what he says. He was shown that God, the Creator, was actually going to come to the earth, and that where he would settle down would be on Mount Sinai. Well, we know from the book of Exodus that's exactly what happened. But then he accelerates beyond that point and begins to describe the final judgment day, when he says, the high mountains shall be shaken, the high hills shall be made low, they shall melt like wax before the flame, and the earth shall be wholly rent asunder. And all that is upon the earth shall perish, and there shall be a judgment upon all men. But listen to what he says. I believe he's referencing Christ quite possibly here. But with the righteous he will make peace, and he will protect the elect. And mercy shall be upon them, and they shall all belong to God, that is the elect. and they shall be prospered, and they shall all be blessed. And he will help them all. And light, who's the light? Jesus, right? Shall appear unto them, and he will make peace with them. He's talking about the elect. He's talking about his church. But then, this is where Jude gets this. And behold, he says, he cometh. So in verse 13 and 14 of first book of Enoch, chapter 1, he appears to be referencing the cross, the coming of the light, the forgiveness of his church, the choosing of the church as his elect. Then in verse 15, he talks about the coming of the Lord, which is where Jude quotes it. Go read the book of Jude. He says, behold, he comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to destroy all the ungodly and to convict all flesh. Now listen, he goes on to say in chapter 16, he begins to talk about what would happen in his time and what would happen pre-flood. He begins to reveal some very interesting things, and here is where the mystery of iniquity begins to be revealed. From the days of the slaughter, he goes on to say, and the destruction and the death of the giants, from the souls of whose flesh the spirits, having gone forth, shall destroy without incurring judgment. Thus shall they destroy, listen, until the day of the consummation. Listen, Paul references this day that Enoch speaks of here, of the consummation. So does Peter. In Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10, Paul calls it the time of reformation, or the return of the Lord, the day of consummation. Peter calls it the time of refreshing. Acts chapter 3, verse 19. You can read those sources there and see that they're referencing more than likely these early writings. Now listen, the great judgment in which the age shall be consummated over the watchers and the godless. Yea, they shall be wholly consummated. Now listen, in his writings, as it's written here, it is said that the watchers in his vision came to him and asked him to speak to the Creator on their behalf. And so the Creator responds in Enoch's writings by saying this, and now as to the watchers who have sent you to intercede for them, who had been aforetime in heaven, tell them this, you have been in heaven, but all the mysteries have not been revealed, or had not been revealed to you. That reminds me of what Apostle Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, when he referenced how the angels desired to look into the mysteries that were revealed to the church by the gospel through Christ. Here we see that same kind of thought here, where it says you've been in heaven, but all the mysteries have not been revealed to you, addressing the watchers. You knew the worthless ones. There's no elaboration here, but there seems to be some kind of revelation of what Paul speaks about in Ephesians chapter 6, when he lists a hierarchy of an entire structure and class of beings within the dimensions beyond the veil of our natural world. He calls them principalities, powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. Here they seem to be being referenced. You've been in heaven, but all the mysteries were not revealed to you. Speaking to the watchers, he said, you knew the worthless ones. And these, listen, in the hardness of your hearts, you have made known to the women. And through these mysteries, women and men work much evil in the earth. Notice the wording, mysteries which were taught to women and men who work much evil in the earth. And he goes on to say that all the children of men may not perish through. Let me read this from here. It says this. And again the Lord said to Raphael, this is later in this book here, bind Azazel. Azazel apparently is the one who led this rebellion. And we ain't got time to get into all that, but you can do your own studies, right? Bind him hand and foot, but listen to this wording, cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert, this opening which is in Dudael. Cast him therein. Place on him rough and jagged rocks. Cover him with darkness. Let him stay there forever, and cover his face that he does not see the light. And On the great day of the great judgment, he shall be cast into the fire. And now heal the earth which the angels have corrupted. Proclaim the healing of the earth, that they may heal the plague, that all the children of men may not perish. Listen, through the secret things that the watchers have disclosed and taught their sons and daughters. The offspring of watchers and the women, their offspring, were taught what Paul references, what we see as an extra biblical source in the book of Enoch, the secret things. Now listen, scholars go on to say this, according to scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They say the book of Enoch brings a character called Azazel into connection with the biblical story, the fall of the angels. The location of that fall apparently was Mount Hermon. It is a gathering place of the fallen spirits of old, the demons of old. Here, Azazel is one of the leaders of the rebellious, leader of the watchers in the time that was before the flood. He taught men the art of warfare, making swords and knives and shields. So what we can learn from this is that this would explain why in Genesis 6 it says violence was upon the face of the earth. Listen, let's bring this up to right now, just from that point itself. We are seeing our streets around the planet filled with incredible violence, filled with incredible crime, an intensity, an anger, a disregard for decency is flowing. Now, as the Lord told us in Luke chapter 21, we would return to the days of Noah, not only before the flood, but post-flood. He was drawing our attention there. What we know from these extra biblical sources is that apparently this fallen angel and its contingent known as the Watchers taught men the art of warfare, making swords, knives, shields, armor, but also taught the women the art of deception by the ornamenting of the body, the dyeing of the hair, the painting of the face and the eyebrows, and also revealed to the people the secrets of witchcraft. There we have that mystery of iniquity. Revealed to the people the secrets of witchcraft and corrupted their manners, leading them into wickedness and impurity until at last he was, at Yahweh's command, bound hand and foot by the archangel Raphael, chained to the rough and jagged rocks of Hadudael, where he is to abide in utter darkness until the great day of judgment, when he will be cast into the fire and consumed from ever. And then it says the whole earth, this is from the book of Enoch, has been corrupted through the works that were taught to them by Azazel. So to him ascribe all sin. Remember what Jude says in Jude verse 6, that God has chained and reserved these angels in everlasting darkness until the day of judgment. He put them in a place called Dudael. Now, let's read. Let's continue here. So, apparently something happened. The legends of what happened, before the flood, these things were carried over the other side of the flood, and more than likely came back into the earth through the knowledge of Ham and his sons, ultimately coming down to Nimrod. I know this in part because of what the Bible draws our attention to. When it gets to verse 8, it says that Cush begat Nimrod. And then as soon as it makes the statement that Nimrod is born, it says of Nimrod, whose name means rebellion, that he began to be a mighty one in the earth. In other words, he was transformed. He was born, but at a particular point, he began to be transformed. He metamorphosed into something far more than just a guy. And we're going to show you this right now. Listen, it says he began to be a mighty one. That's verse 8. Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. In order to understand this, you have to look up these words, but the word began comes from the word halal. Now pay attention. The word halal, or began, so when it says he began, it literally means, and he halal. The word halal means to bore, to pierce, to become wounded, to dissolve by opening a wedge. And one of the translators of this word says, through ritual and sexual occult practice. I know, it's pretty dark stuff, right? But there's a connection between what is being revealed here, between the dark arts and sexual energy. And this is one of the reasons that the scripture is very much emphatic upon the proper context for sexual relations. I don't want to get into a sermon on sex, right? But I'm just telling you what it says and what the translator says that word means. So let's take this now. Something happened to him that he determined he wanted to be part of that, the information that he heard. And so when it says he began to be, he halaled. Whatever he did caused him to dissolve by opening a wedge and to be mortally wounded. That's literally what that means. To be, he began, halal, haya, or to be. He began to be. So it implies, halal, that he was wounded through this ritual, causing him to dissolve or to lose the essence of his life. Now, understand, we're talking about who is Antichrist. And we've gone to the beginning to see if we can get some clues as to who he is and who he might be in the future. It is interesting how in the book of Revelation chapter 13 we are told that the beast will have a deadly wound that is healed. Well, this is kind of what we're seeing here in the beginning concerning Nimrod. He was halal, he was pierced, he was wounded, he dissolved, the essence of his soul dissolved. And it was done as if by opening a wedge, and one of the translators says it literally is implying occult ritual with sexual energy involved in it. This is what he was doing. And once he reached that point of nothingness, he began to be haya. He reemerges and comes into existence as if he is reanimated. He began to be a mighty one. That word mighty one comes from the word gibor or giborim. It literally means a giant, a warrior, a tyrant. Now, why is giant important? Because that's what we were told happened in Genesis 6 before the flood. That giants were born unto the women who engaged in these practices with beings from another dimension called the Ben Elohim, or the sons of God. The resulting offspring from this unholy union were the legends of old, the mythologies of old, if you will, the demigods, the giants of old, the Nephilim, some call them, or they're also known as the Giborim. This is what appears to be being told us, that Nimrod reached a point after some time to where he engaged in some very dark occultic practice. Where did he get that knowledge? Obviously it was taught to him. By who? By Ham and his sons. Cush, his eldest. Nimrod, Cush's son. Something intrigued Nimrod and he pursued that knowledge. It cost him a transition. It cost him his very soul. But when he was reanimated as a mighty one, a Giborim. This will make sense to you as we go along even more, because this is where we are today. But I get ahead of myself. Listen. The word Giborim is very important to understand. Giborim, according to the rabbis, are a class of beings. This term is used in Genesis 6:4, which describes the Nephilim as Giborim. The word Giborim is used in the Old Testament or the Tanakh over 150 times. It is applied to men, to lions, and to hunters, soldiers, and leaders. All qualities and descriptions of the son of perdition. Now listen. So let's read this again in verse 8. Cush begets Nimrod, and he halal. He engaged in something that caused him to be wounded. He did so by the opening of a wedge, quite possibly through ritual and occult practice that had been taught to him by secret knowledge that had been brought over from the other side of the flood through the line of Ham. It caused him to be tempted to want to, he must have heard those stories of these giants, and he wanted to give himself to that. He wanted to become that. And he understood how to get there, because the word halal means to dissolve. To be haya means to be reanimated or come back into existence. In essence, he was, he is not, and yet he became. Now, after his transformation, remember what Paul said, the antichrist will emerge after the working of Lucifer, after Satan's working. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. What does Nimrod do after he rises from the dead, so to speak? He immediately begins to defy God. He becomes a mighty hunter before the Lord. In other words, he exalts himself, right? Consider what else we see here. I want to show you something real quick, and I know I laid a lot of groundwork here, but listen. I want to show you something. When he emerges from this, whatever he did, in verse 9, it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, in his face. Nimrod, it says, became a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Very interesting. It's repeated twice, but we'll talk about that in a second. But before we get to there, I want you to consider something. Remember what John said in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. He said that in order to understand the beast that's coming, you'll have to understand the number of his name. For it is the number of a man, and that number is 666. Check this out. Consider what else we can see here in this story. Go back and look at this, because what we have revealed here in verse 7, who the sons of Cush are, I named them to you. Verse 7, chapter 10. Seba, Havila, Sabta, Ra'ama, Sabteka. How many is that? Seba, 1. Havila, 2. Sabta, 3. Rama, 4. Sabteka, 5. Nimrod is 6. The rebellious one, the one who transformed, the one who through occult practice was wounded and dissolved only to be reanimated, was number 6. I think John is drawing our attention to him because it's quite possible he is going to reemerge again. Listen, Nimrod is the 6th. Remember what he said, here is the mind that has wisdom. There's also some very interesting phraseology here. Look at verse 9. It says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Why does it repeat twice? Nothing in the scripture is there by accident. He repeats this twice. Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, 1. Number 2, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. He repeats it twice in the first verse. And I believe this is repeated twice because it's hinting that he was not only going to be Nimrod once, but in the far-flung future, one like him, a rebellious one, would come who would also defy God and stand in his face. John, in essence, in Revelation, is describing the beast, right? And how does he describe him? He describes him as someone that was. But at the time that he wrote the book of Revelation, he is not. But yet he will be. Something called Apollyon, Revelation chapter 9, verse 11, is going to ascend out of the bottomless pit and be allowed to go into this one, just as this one was allowed to go into Nimrod and reanimate him when he became a foreshadow and really the first antichrist. Now, I'm almost done. Listen, let's go a little deeper here. Genesis 10:10. What does it say about him? Pay attention to this, because these are keys. 10. And the beginning of his kingdom, Nimrod's kingdom, is what? Babel. Look, it says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Let's go a little deeper here. Genesis 10:10. It lays out the pattern and the flow which reaches across the millenniums and will come to rest and has come to rest in our time. It is seen, if you have eyes to see, in the cities that he built. Remember, he's that type of that wicked one. He is the one who was. He's the sixth son. He builds 4 cities: Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. Let's look at these cities and we're going to see something really interesting. The beginning of his kingdom is called Babel. Babel will be mentioned in connection with the confusing of the languages in in chapter 11. But in chapter 10, in connection with Nimrod, it's mentioned to his kingdom, and it is taught in this way that when his kingdom began, not ended, but began, it began with Babel. Listen, the word Babel literally means to mingle or commingle and to bring confusion. In essence, this is what happened to him. He became an animal, beast, human thing inhabited by a spirit. The altering of his DNA, he became a chimera, if you can see it. Confusion was the beginning of his kingdom. Mingling was the beginning of his kingdom. What this reveals is that when we reach the time when genetic mingling is possible again, Babel, we will know that the return of Nimrod is close at hand, or the antichrist, the son of perdition. Have we seen any possibility of this in our time? Well, yes. In my research recently, I came across something called the Human Genome Project. Check this out. The Human Genome Project was an international scientific research project with the goal of determining the base pairs that make up human DNA, the identifying and the mapping and the sequencing of all the genes of the human genome from both a physical and a functional standpoint. I find that phraseology very interesting. Not only were they seeking to understand the physical nature of DNA, they were trying to peer deeper into how does it function? How does it work? What is the code that unlocks DNA? And you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? What is it that they want to do this for? Listen to this. It started in 1990. It was completed in 2003. It remains the world's largest collaborative biological project. Planning started after the idea was picked up in 1984 by who? The U.S. government. The project formally launched in 1990 and was declared essentially complete on April 14, 2003, but it only included about 85% of the human genome. Up to that point, when they started it, and by April 14, 2003, they had reached 85%. But level complete genome was achieved, listen to this, in May of 2021. Excuse me, with the remaining only 0.3% bases covered by potential issues. But listen to this. The final gapless assembly was finished January 2022. Very interesting. When they finally completed the Human Genome Project and everything and all the gaps were closed in, understanding both its physical qualities and its functional purpose, it was completed in January of 2022. What happened? If we go back to the beginning of this year, war breaks out all over the planet. I believe it's tied, chaos, mingling, confusion, if you can see it. Another interesting thing, if you remember, and this is, by the way, this is their logo. On the logo, it talks about chemistry, biology, physics, and engineering. That's the logo, and it's a man wrapped in DNA. I hope you're following what I'm telling you here. There was an interesting little event that happened a few weeks ago before the Queen died. Go look it up on YouTube. There was a ceremony called the Jubilee ceremony, like 70 years or something, I think it was. There's an interesting thing they had her do. She walks up to this device They hand her, I think it's the world or something like that, on a pillow. She goes over to this device with it, and then she pushes a button, and then it lights up this thing on the ground where she's at, and it turns into a strand of DNA. And after she touches it, it lights up and goes across the ground into the tree of knowledge, or of the knowledge of good and evil, I say, but they call it the tree of life. Are they telling us something? Because that happened this year in 2022. The DNA project was finally completed after all these years, beginning in 1984, in January of 22. She lights up a strand of DNA and it goes into the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They call it the tree of life, but that's where the serpent was. Were they trying to tell us something? I think so. Listen. The Human Genome Project goes on. Funding came from the American government through the National Institute of Health. Does that sound familiar? Who runs the National Institute of Health? That little guy, Dr. Fauci. Isn't it interesting that 2020 happens? All of a sudden we're all into injecting the human population with an experimental vaccine. Some say it's mRNA technology that alters DNA. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know. But all of this is coming together at the same time. But this is interesting. As well as numerous other groups from around the world. Listen to this. A parallel project was started, but it was conducted outside of government interference by a corporation called Celera Corporation. I find that incredibly interesting, because what we're being told here is this whole genome project, the altering or the study of both physical and functioning DNA for the human family, was also being researched in an obscure corporation in underground laboratories outside the prying eyes of governments and nations. Sounds a little bit like X-Men, right? What's going on in these dark places of the earth? I think they're pursuing the pre-flood knowledge. Now listen, it goes on to say, the finished human genome is a mosaic. It is that the project has come from the fact that the human genome is the same in all humans. The prophet Daniel spoke of this time, of the altering of human DNA. How much time I got? Okay, I got about 5 minutes. Listen, I'm laying the groundwork for next week's study too, so hopefully you'll join us then. Look at what Daniel references, because this is what happened to Nimrod. This is what's going to happen to the antichrist in the future just ahead of us. And it's also going to happen to every single person that takes the mark of the beast. Listen. Why do you think it says in one place that men will seek to die, but they won't be able to? Book of Revelation. Why? After taking the mark. Something's going to happen. Not only to the physical structure of their DNA, but to its function. Now listen. It goes on to say this in Daniel. You can read it yourself. Daniel chapter 2 verse 43. In the revelation of giving the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, and whereas you saw iron mixed with clay, listen to the phraseology, they, speaking of a future entity or groups of entities, they shall mingle themselves, Babel, with the seed or the DNA of men. Daniel chapter 2 verse 43. I went and broke this down. You can do it yourself. Got into the original language to see if I was just chasing rabbits or I was actually onto something. Yes, Daniel is actually talking about a DNA hybrid kind of scenario here. The word indeed is they will combine or mix with one another in the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, even as iron cannot be mixed with clay. It's implying that this attempt to mingle with the genetic material of humanity is going to be attempted. And it's going to be allowed, but it's going to fail. Because only God knows the perfect code, right? All right, let's go on. So, the next thing that he does here, let's see here, is go on to the rest of the cities. Okay, look. So let's put the cities in order. we have Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. Remember Genesis chapter 10? Those are the 4 cities. It begins with Babel. I'm putting forth this thesis to you that it's mentioned and written that way in chapter 10 concerning Nimrod, number 6 son, that the beginning of his kingdom is a hint to us, a clue, that when we reach the time of confusion or mingling, Babel, that it will be a trigger point for us to understand we are very close. I just read to you, I believe that is the human DNA, human genome project that was completed January of this year. Now listen, he goes on to say he builds 4 cities, Babel, Erech, Akkad. Listen to this, because when you interpret what their names mean, it's very fascinating. Babel, again, we're in Genesis chapter 10, verse 10. Babel means in the time of the mingling, or confusion and mingling. Erech is the next kingdom he built. Erech means something that occurs after a long time. Akkad, the 3rd city he built, means subtlety, or through the serpent's subtlety. And then he builds Calneh, which means the temple of Anu. So let's just take a look at this. What's literally being told us if we interpret the names of the cities is, in the time when the commingling is made possible, which will occur after a long time in the future, through the subtle working of Satan or the serpent, the temple of Anu will be constructed. Well, what is, okay, so I'm like, oh my goodness, this is craziness, right? So I said, okay, so what is this temple of Anu? Well, check this out. Anu. This is what Nimrod did. He built a temple to Anu. Anu, originally called An, is the divine personification of the sky god, or the king of gods. He's the ancestor of many of the deities in ancient Mesopotamian religion. He is regarded as the source of both divine and human kingship. Now listen, his abode is heaven, the prince of the power of the air. I hope you're following me. Go back and listen to this if you're not. His symbol is the crown with horns on it. Now listen, the number or the numerical value of his name is 60. So we have Nimrod, the 6th son, building a temple to Anu, whose numerical value is 60. That's 60 and 6. The numbers beginning to come together. We're being drawn to this story. Here's the mind that has wisdom so that we can learn something. Who is this horned God? It's interesting as I looked it up because it literally means that he built a temple to the horned God. He is the God of nature, of wilderness, of occult ritual sexuality. He is the hunting God. It's interesting that Nimrod is called a mighty hunter. He is a foreshadow. And he's married to the triple goddess in mythology. That's Babylon. The horned god represents the male part of religion's duotheistic theological system. His consort is the female, Babylon. She is the mother goddess. In common Wiccan belief, he, the horned god, is associated with nature, wilderness, occult sexuality, and hunting. He is always shown with either horns or antlers. He's depicted as being a theriocephalic, which means he's depicted as having the head of a beast. In this way, what is emphasized is that this is the union of the divine and the animal, and in the future predicts a time when both the divine, the animal, and human nature will combine into one. That is the last place that Nimrod built. All of that goes into it. It was known as the fortress of Anu. Now, I've got like 2 minutes. I want you to read Genesis 11, verse 1 and 2, because it gets really incredible there. Listen, again, let's review those 4 cities. It literally means that when the time of mingling is possible, after a long time, meaning length of days, Akkad, or through subtlety, the serpent of subtlety, will erect a fortress of Anu, the sky god, Kalne. This is why Nimrod built it last, because it's meant to be a prophecy of our time. You can go read in Daniel chapter 11, speaking of that wicked one, he honors what? The God of fortresses. He honors the God of forces. Now, in Genesis 11, verse 1, it says that, now we can understand a little bit better, right? It says, the whole earth was of one language and one speech. As we near the time of antichrist, we should be seeing the same thing. Well, we are. We can all communicate again. We weren't able to do it then, after God confused the languages, but it has come full circle. One language means akkad, to be united. The root word akkad means to be unified in thought. This means more than just speaking the same language. It means what was spoken was a unified thought of the whole world, or the elite of the world at that time. They were of one language and one speech. The word speech is from the Hebrew word dabar. It means a particular word or a particular matter. This possibly indicates that something, a word, a matter, was being spoken so powerfully that it united them. This is Nimrod. I believe it was Nimrod who told them, because when they saw him, they followed him. Something changed in him where suddenly they followed him. I believe he began to reveal to them that pre-flood wisdom. And we think we know this because of what Paul talked about, that ancient mystery of iniquity, attempting to bring about the wicked one. Now listen, in Genesis 11 verse 2 it says, it came to pass that they began to journey from the east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. I'm hurrying, but listen, interesting, they journeyed from the east. Remember, when they got out of the boat, they were all kind of hanging out there, right? So in essence, it represents where God allowed them to come to rest, where God spoke to Noah and all that stuff. By them setting off and removing themselves from that place, they were collectively saying to the Creator, we want to get as far away as possible from you. We want to go somewhere else. It says they journeyed, and what? It says they found a plain. Interesting words, right? What does it mean? It means they were looking for something. It could have said, and they came to a plain, or they came to a valley. It doesn't say that. It says they found a plain. That's interesting. Why? Because the word found comes from the word matzah in the Hebrew. It means that to have a supernatural appearance and to attain or acquire something. It appears they were looking for a particular location, and they found it. In a plain, baka, baki. The plain literally means to rip or to tear, or to open a breach, to rent an opening in the land of Shinar between two rivers. They were looking for a geographic location where they could cause a tear in the fabric of space and time. And this is why it goes on to reveal to us in Genesis 11 verse 4, what? They built a tower, a migdal. Listen to what one of the ancient rabbis says about this. Rabbi Ariel Zadok, he says, and in looking deeper into the Hebrew words within the text for a more clear understanding of what was actually going on in the narrative, he notes that the Hebrew words for journeyed from the east comes from the word kedem, and it has the connotation of moving away from the ancient way or from the way of God. He then points out that the words found a plain is not the Hebrew word bika, which means valley, but it is bikaiya, which means an opening or a discovery. Ancient rabbinical commentaries, he concludes, say that the people in this story may actually have found some sort of ancient technology from before the flood of Noah's time. Technology so advanced that it got the attention of heaven, causing God himself to pay attention and to take corrective action by scattering them across the face of the earth. They built a migdal. The term migdal comes from where we get the word in Hebrew for a pyramid-like structure. They were attempting, and I gotta close, to build something which Nimrod led them to, which would open a portal, a wormhole, a tear in the veil, and allow those pre-flood watchers that he had been told about to come back into the earth. Is there any wonder why God shut it down? I'll pick it up from here next week, but I want to just show you, this is why we see these things, because once they were scattered all over the world, we see these things. These are this is the ziggurat of Ur, these monolithic structures. This is the pyramid of Teotihuacan in Mexico, another pyramid, another structure. These are the Mayan pyramids of Tikal. This is the Great Pyramid of Cholula. They built a church on top of it. This is the pyramids, the Nubian pyramids in the Sudan. And of course, the most famous of all and the oldest, the pyramids of Giza. It's very, very interesting to me that these structures exist all over the world. They're found all over the world. Why? Because every one of those societies was attempting to do the very same thing that they were attempting to do in the beginning. That's why they went with this knowledge everywhere and built these structures, attempting to access portals. It's an incredible battle that we're being taught. But listen, I want to finish with this. Something happened in 1992. We began to see a movement toward something very unique. I want you to look at this because I think we've come back. This is from a poster of the European Parliament building in Strasbourg. It was designed, I'm not making this up, after the Tower of Babel, a 16th century painting by Bruegel. Tower of Babel, European Parliament building. Here's another photo. Tower of Babel, European Parliament building. They were announcing back then the intention to reconstruct another Tower of Babel through unity and one language. I'm not saying that all these people are in on it, but what I am telling you is the spirit of it, the working of Satan, the mystery of iniquity at elite levels, which Paul warned us about, said that it would happen. And it would happen in that far-flung future. Now listen, in case we didn't get the message, when they announced this, they put this picture out. This was a poster they created in 1992. Those of you who understand symbols, notice what they're announcing here. For those of you who know, this is the symbol of Baphomet, the occult symbol of Satan himself. What an odd thing for the European Union to declare with this poster in 1992. Recently, I came across a message that was given at one of these elite gatherings of the occult. They claim to have channeled something. This is just from a few weeks ago. This is what they said came through the channel. I am your teacher, Baphomet. I am also Sophia. My name means wisdom. I am also the great serpent god of the ages. From the start of time and until the end, I am the sleeping serpent which is waiting to be awakened in all human beings. I am the serpent of wisdom and knowledge in the Garden of Eden, that open the inner eye of human beings so that they may understand the tree of knowledge of both yin and yang in order for humans to evolve and move forward to reach illumination. I am both male and female, transgender movement, yet I am neither. I am the teacher of the very first human beings, and I am still your teacher if you are willing to listen. We are the watchers. We are the ancient ones. And the message concludes. This is what the occult elite are saying they are hearing. All of this I've shared today is so overwhelming. I know, and you've heard a lot of information, but you go back and listen to it and take notes and do your own studies. But I'm not ending on a downer. We are entering and have entered this time. And I want to just close with this, because what we know by that and what should excite the believers is that in seeing all these things, we know that though the times we are living in are absolutely insane, right? We know that it is also what Jesus said: when you begin to see these things come to pass, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. Listen to what it says here, speaking of the wicked ones in the coming rebirth of Nimrod. These have one mind, they will give their power, their strength unto the beast. These are going to make war with the Lamb. But listen, the Lamb shall overcome them. Why? For he is the Lord, and he is the Lord of lords, and he is the King of kings. They that are with him are called, faithful, and chosen. God's children do not need to be afraid. This is a grand story that's been being told throughout the ages. We are the most privileged of generations as we have come to this time, when all of these events are now converging into one great, final, titanic battle for the ages. Jesus Christ is coming. Question is, whose side will you be found to be on? For those who know him, it is a time of great excitement, anticipation, trepidation. Of course, we wouldn't be human if we didn't feel that way. But excitement within our hearts, knowing that all the signs are pointing to the coming of the Lord. Put your trust in nothing else but Jesus Christ and his kingdom. I hope this study has been a blessing to you. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Be praying for us as we have prayed for you every single day. God bless you. And remember, always, always keep looking up. See you next time.